12. L. Kurgel and Vimet in Russian by 960 and 1965. 65. Methodology and African prehistory. Some Haitian intellectuals showed an interest in local African-derived folk culture from the time of Drive Pricemar's early work in the 1920s, and the influence of cultural Afro-Cubanism was strong with Cuban literary figures like Nicholas Gillan, but there, as in Brazil, the interest in Afro-American culture did not lead on to an interest in Africa, much less in African history. In the British West Indies, decolonization, including the decolonization of West Indian history, had a higher priority, and political Pan-Africanism among West Indian intellectuals rarely had historical overtones, even in the 1960s. Interest was even slighter in the United States before the 1960s, and what interest existed was concentrated on North Africa. The recent compilation listing North American doctoral theses on African history shows 74 completed up to and including the year 960, quite an amazing total on the face of it, but the total is deceptive. Most were on North Africa, and almost all were done by historians whose professional concentration was on classical history or archaeology, on the history of North Africa and the Middle East, or on European overseas colonization generally. The fact that their doctoral research happened to touch on Africa was almost a matter of chance. Only a few of those who wrote on colonial history became Africa specialists in a broader sense. One of the pioneers was Harry R. Rutten at Yale, who began publishing on German colonial history in Africa during the 1930s and shifted to a broader concern for Africa in the 1950s. Afro-Americans were still more important as a group. W. E. B. Du Bois became interested in Africa early in his career, though he had no opportunity to pursue the interest actively until his retirement and emigration to Ghana in 1961. Long before, in 1916, Carter G. Woodson had founded the Journal of Negro History. It was more Afro-American than African in focus, but it included African history in its official scope and published occasional articles on the African past. Another advocate of African history was William Leo Hansberry of Howard University, who waged a lonely campaign for the inclusion of African history in the teaching program of American universities, especially in the then segregated, predominantly black colleges in the southern states. Of varying degrees, then, the base for the future development of African history outside Africa already existed before I-960. The achievement of independence in North Africa and tropical Africa during a few years scattered on either side of that date, gave Africa a new burst of publicity overseas, aroused popular interest, and some oft-had interest was directed to the African past, not just to its present and future. The development of African history over the years since I-960 was disappointing in some places and surprising in others. In North Africa, for example, initial interest was limited to the history of a particular country, at most that of North Africa. In spite of a political emphasis on African unity, North African universities and scholars moved only slightly towards a more continental approach to the study of their own past. The Maghreb belonged. 66. Recent trends in African historiography and their contribution to history in general. To the Mediterranean world, to the Muslim world, and to the Francophone intellectual world that still centered in Paris. These three worlds were more than enough for the full attention of the educated public. Egyptian public spokesmen often made much of the fact that Egypt was African as well as Arab and Muslim, but Egyptian historical scholarship was far more parochial, even at a time when the Aswan DFM and the international archaeological teams working in Nubia directed attention up the Nile. Historical scholarship in southern Africa was still more parochial. The political domination of the Republic of South Africa by overseas Europeans was unrelaxed, and African history was hardly noticed in the universities where history still meant the history of Europe and the history of the European minority in South Africa. The Oxford History of South Africa 1969-71 was an important move to broaden its scope so as to include the African majority, but one of the co-editors, Leonard Thompson, no longer practiced the historian's craft in South Africa, and the other, Monica Wilson, was a historically minded anthropologist. Historical studies in Zimbabwe or Rhodesia moved towards the inclusion of African history briefly in the early 1960s, but that move was reversed after the white majority's unilateral declaration of independence from Britain. Curiously enough, Zimbabwe has produced more African historical scholars per capita than South Africa has done, but most have been forced to pursue professional careers in exile. The first home of African history on the African continent was tropical Africa, and it was there that the most significant development took place in the first decade of independence. African history was already a part of the curriculum in tropical universities, but the new problem was to readjust to an appropriate balance of local, regional, African and world history. It was a question, in short, of decolonizing the whole history curriculum, not merely adding an African component. The greatest change has been in Anglophone Africa, where the rigidity of European standards relaxed more rapidly than they did in Francophone countries. The teaching of English and imperial history gave way to new subjects. British imperial history has tended to drop out altogether, while British history merged with European history. Within European history as taught in Africa, rethinking has tended to subordinate individual national histories to an emphasis on major themes like urbanization or the Industrial Revolution, viewed across national lines. Meanwhile, African historians have also turned their attention to non-European history, to the history of the Islamic world to the north with special emphasis on its impact on Africa south of the Sahara, to the history of Latin America or Southeast Asia which could be seen as a parallel to the African experience, to the history of Asia where the economic growth in Japan was an example from which Africa might learn. The impact of African history was thus to bring about a general reorientation to a view of the world and its past that will be truly Afrocentric, not exclusively concerned with Africa and Africans the way the old European tradition was exclusively. 67. Methodology and African prehistory. Concerned with Europeans, but nevertheless a Velton Shau where Africa, not Europe, was the point of departure. This goal is still incompletely realized, even in the most advanced of the Anglophone universities. It will inevitably take time as a new generation of innovating African historians are trained and move off in new directions of their own choosing. Francophone universities have lagged behind by about a decade. Abidjan, Dakar and Lubumbashi as heir to Libanium in the field of history represent the oldest Francophone universities, and their history staffs came to be largely African only in the early 1970s, a shift that had taken place in the oldest Anglophone universities by the early 1960s. With African historians and OW in place in Francophone universities, a similar readjustment of historical worldview can be expected. Reformed history curricula were introduced in the secondary schools of the French-speaking countries as early as 1963, however. This was immediately followed by a reform of the university history courses within the framework of the program of the CMBF Conciled Africain et Melgag pour l'enseignement supérieur. The impact of African history on the investigation and teaching of history in Western Europe is tied with the former colonial relationship. This is one reason why France and England have been the leading European centers of African history. The teaching of African history has nevertheless made some progress elsewhere, especially in Czechoslovakia and Poland, and in the USSR African history is taught systematically at the Tresalu University in Moscow, whose specific role is the education of students from Africa. Elsewhere, research by isolated scholars goes on in scattered university centers, more systematically at research institutes that follow the Germanic tradition of university organization. As a result, Africanist research is a little isolated. This may well be part of the reason why African history has not infiltrated history in many European universities outside England and France. The general tradition of historical studies is equally parochial in those countries, but they had a special responsibility in the first instance for the training of colonial civil servants. After about 1955, these men began to be repatriated, and several of them settled in a new career as historians of the countries they once administered. This was especially the case in France, where Professors Deschamps and Persson are notable examples. For France and England alike, the creation and growth of the new African universities of the 1950s meant that employment opportunities existed in Africa. Young historians took up African themes in their training research, or else turned to African history once they found themselves teaching in Africa. Then, in the 1960s and 1970s, those expatriate historians have been gradually replaced by Africans and reabsorbed into the metropolitan educational establishment, often after a period of 8 to 10 years in Africa. Not all returned to teach African history, but the total numbers were significant. perhaps 60 to 70 historians taken into British universities from African universities. 68. Recent trends in African historiography and their contribution to history in general. From the mid-1960s to the mid-1970s, or about 8 to 10% of history recruitment into British universities over that period. PY 1974, 3 chairs in modern history, which traditionally has meant the history of modern Britain, were held by historians whose main research career has been devoted to Africa. It is still too early to see what impact this re-entry from Africa will have on British historical traditions generally, but it may well be significant. In France the comparative numbers are somewhat smaller, and those returning from Africa are a smaller proportion of university recruitment, but a similar process has taken place. A new generation of historians began to turn its attention to Africa. In Paris, both in its several universities and in the Inter-University Centre d'études africaines, the number of scholars in history, sociology and archaeology have served in African universities for varying periods of time and still retain close contact with them. It is much the same in Aix, Bordeaux and Lyon. Meanwhile, both British and French universities served as centres for training African historians who were to replace the expatriates. 3. This has tended to give institutions like the School of Oriental and African Studies SOAs in London or more scattered sections of the Sorbonne and the specialist graduate schools in Paris a special role. At SOAS, for example, 58% of those who completed PhDs between 1963 and 1973 took UP initial teaching posts in Africa. Less than 20% of the total were British and only 13% of the total took up initial posts in British universities. For this diminished somewhat the direct impact on British education of SOAS, which has the largest staff of Africanist historians to be found in any university in the world. The indirect influence was nevertheless considerable. In addition to SOAS, the universities of Birmingham, Sussex and Edinburgh have created a special niche for African history within the courses offered, and at least 8 others have a specialist in African history regularly teaching the subject at the undergraduate level. This special level of development in Britain was, perhaps, predictable in the light of British colonial and neo-colonial interests in African university structures. The unpredictable development of the 1960s was the enormous growth of Africanist historical scholarship in North America. It was unpredictable in part because historians of the United States had a bad record for dealing fairly with the history of Afro-Americans in their own society. The large minority of African descent had also been there all along without provoking the notable interest in Africa, even from the majority of the Afro-Americans. And the burst of African historical studies came from Canada as well as the United States, even though Canada had neither. The 13. I would like to thank Professor J.F. Adjei of the University of Ibadan, and Professors J.D. Fitch and Roland Oliver for information on the impact of African history on history generally in Europe and Africa respectively. Any errors of fact or emphasis that may appear here are nevertheless our responsibility. 14. R. Oliver, 1973. 69. Methodology and African Prehistory. Experience of ruling part of Africa, like Britain, or a large Afro-American minority, like the United States. Before I-960, African history was hardly taught at all in North America. In 1959, shortly after the foundation of an African Studies Association, only 21 of its members resident in the United States or Canada identified themselves as historians. So of these, less than half were in university positions that called for a major commitment of their time to African history. The First International Congress of Africanists, held in Accra in 1962, was attended by some 800 persons in whose presence President K.W.M. Nkrumah, in an opening address, outlined the responsibilities of historical studies for the new Africa. Then came the explosion. By 1970, the number of North American specialists in African history or archaeology had risen to about 350. Some were historians originally trained in some other field, who moved over and began teaching the research on African history, but the great majority were young scholars who were just emerging from graduate school. North American graduate schools turned out more than 300 PhD degrees in African history between 1960 and 1972. Some were students from Africa who planned to return to Africa. A few were from Europe, but the great majority were North Americans in about the same proportion of Afro to Euro-Americans as in the population at large, that is, about 10% in the United States, much less in Canada. The growth of African history in North America was pushed forward by two contrary tendencies in historical studies. From the Afro-American community came the strongly expressed belief that African history was the special possession of African peoples and their descendants on other continents in the same way that European national history has been the special possession of each European nation. The implicit difference between the purposes of African history for Africans and African history in the framework of world history came into the open. Difference, however, is not necessarily conflict. The two kinds of history are not mutually incompatible, though each will emphasize quite different aspects of the past. As a result, the parochial pattern of ethnocentric history was more seriously shaken in North America than it was elsewhere. In many schools, the old world history that was really only a history of Western civilization gave way in the 1960s to a new and more genuine attempt to examine history in world perspective. And in this effort Africa entered on equal terms with other major culture areas like South Asia or East Asia. White departments of history in North American universities began moving from the old division between American and European history to a threefold division, with the history of the Third World gaining equality as a third branch of historical studies. These changes are still far from complete, but, taken alongside the spread of African history in Britain and France, and alongside the reorientation of the history curriculum in African universities, they mark a step along the road towards the full impact of African history on history as a whole. 70. Recent trends in African historiography and their contribution to history in general. Success in the longer run will depend on the combined efforts of African scholars writing the history of their OWN societies, on those of non-African historians who interpret African history to other societies, and on a broadening of international social science to the point where scholars in other disciplines will have to consider African data as a relevant basis for any generalization about human society. 71. Sources and specific techniques used in African history, general outline. The general rules of historical criticism that make history a documentary technique, and the historical approach that requires us to study human society in its journey down the ages, are the essential stock in trade of any historian in any country. Neglect of this fact meant that the peoples of Africa were for a long time outside the field of Western historians, for WHOM Europe was the whole of history. What lay behind this attitude, though it did not show itself openly, was a persistent belief that, in the absence of written texts and archaeological monuments, Africa did not really have any history. Hence the first task of a historian is obviously the establishing of sources, which is itself linked to the basic theoretical problem of appraising the techniques of historical research. The number of research workers, impelled by a great new urge to learn and understand following the advent of the post-colonial era, have laid the foundations of African history once and for all, though the methodology appropriate to it is still being worked out. Huge areas of documentation have come to light and have enabled research workers to ask themselves NW questions. As more of African history becomes known, it becomes more varied and develops in new and unexpected directions. During the past 15 years or so there has been a revolution in the tools of research, and it is now readily accepted that some of these are particularly useful for African history. They include geology, paleontology, prehistory, archaeology, paleobotany, palynology, the use of radioactive isotopes to yield absolute chronological data, physical geography and human problems, ethnological and sociological observation and analysis, oral tradition, historical and comparative linguistics, European, Arabic, Indian and Chinese written texts, and economic and demographic documents which lend themselves to computerization. The sources of African history are still remarkably flexible in scope and therefore new types of intellectual cooperation, which unexpectedly bring together sectors hitherto regarded as distinct, should always be thoroughly explored. The use of a combination of sources emerges as a qualitative. Sources and specific techniques used in African history, general outline innovation. Only the simultaneous application of various categories of sources can ensure any real temporal depth, for an isolated fact tends to remain on the fringe of the general trend. The overall integration of methods and the combination of sources represent an effective contribution by Africa both to knowledge and to contemporary historiographical awareness. A historian's curiosity ought to follow several trajectories at once. His work is not limited to the establishing of sources. He must use a sound interdisciplinary culture to make himself master of man's past. For history is modern man's view of the whole of time past. Most of the sources and techniques specific to African history which are drawn from mathematics, atomic physics, geology, the natural sciences and the human and social sciences are amply described in the present volume. I shall therefore concentrate here on aspects and problems not treated elsewhere. The most decisive methodological advance of recent years is unquestionably the application of modern physics to the study of man's past. The use of radioactive isotopes gives us a chronological gauge to the earliest days of Homo sapiens in the case of the carbon-14 method, and to periods more than 1 million years ago in the case of the potassium-argon method. These absolute dating methods now considerably shorten discussion on matters of human paleontology and prehistory. The earliest hominids in Africa have been dated by the potassium-argon method to 530,000 before our era. This being the age of a fragment of hominid lower jaw with an intact molar found in 1971 by Professor Brian Patterson at Ogum, in Kenya. Again, the hominid teeth discovered in the Villafranchian layers of the Otembo Valley in northern Ethiopia, by French expeditions under Camille Aramberg and Yves Coppens and P. Clark-Howell's American expedition, are between 2 and 4 million years old. The Zinjanthropus level eye of the famous site at Oldoway Gorge, in Tanzania, has been dated, also by the potassium-argon method, as 1 to 75 million years old. Thus thanks to the potassium-argon isotope the birth of East African MN, the oldest of all according to the present state of our knowledge, is actually the birth of man as a whole, to the extent that monophyleism is more and more generally accepted in general paleontology. The African fossil remains now KNOW and thus provide the essential ingredients for an answer to the key question of the origins of man, which has been asked in so many different ways throughout the history of mankind. Where was MN born, and when? The old stereotyped ideas which relegated Africa to the fringes of the realm of history have been completely transformed. Facts brought to light by the use of a variety of sources and methods. In the above-mentioned examples, human paleontology and nuclear physics have 1. J. D. Birdsell, 1972, page 299. 73. Methodology and African Prehistory brought out clearly the great span of African history, the origin of which coincides with that of Homo faber himself. Information from other sources, for instance the earth sciences, also throw some light on African history independently of all written documents. The way of life and history of the peoples of the Lake Chad Basin, for example, would be hard to understand were it not for the contribution made by physical geography. It is worth stressing the methodological value of this approach. Human and other living beings are not distributed at random in the Chad Basin, which may be described in altitude terms broadly as follows. The central accumulation plain at a height of between 180 and 300 meters is surrounded by a somewhat irregular ring of old, weathered plateaus, their penaplanation sometimes masked by recent volcanic activity, handling these plateaus, which are on average 900 meters high, to the lower accumulation areas are usually steep slopes affected by active erosion in a humid climate. The highest population density, 6 to 15 inhabitants per square kilometer, is found in the area of very light detrital soils which receives rain. Density is also fairly high in the succulent climate alluvial areas irrigated by seepage or flooding from Lake Chad. The high plateaus of Darfur and Adamawa to the east and south, where the tributaries of the lake rise, the population is only 1 per square kilometer, and in the north, already Saharan in character, it is lower still. The population pattern of the depression is thus closely linked to and conditioned by questions of physical geography and geomorphology. As a result, civilization has retreated before the desert, falling back to the area where millet and sorghum can be grown without irrigation, i.e. roughly to the latitude of the Nile Chad vegetables. Tobacco and durum wheat are grown under irrigation on the banks of the Logan and Shari rivers. Farmers, herdsmen and fishermen live in the southern area, where lake and river water irrigates the soil, keeps the pastures green and regularly attracts crowds of fishermen. In the northern desert area, on the other hand, erosion makes the soil unstable and plant life precarious. It is characteristically a thorny xerophilic bush or scrub. But these geomorphological factors have also conditioned other human activities. For example, invasion has often driven native farmers from the salubrious plateaus and fertile plains to steep mountainous areas unsuitable for stock breeding. In this way the Fulani drove the Buni and the Duru back to the least fertile parts of Adamawa, and the Kiroy of North Cameroon back to the granite scree of the Mandara Massif. It is admittedly harder and less rewarding for these peoples to work the sloping, previously submerged soils, but their primitive tools give more satisfactory results there. Seasonal or permanent marshland in the alluvial area gives rise to swarms of mosquitoes Anopheles gambii. Tsetse flies Glossina also breed in the low-growing hygrophile masses of Salix and Mimosa aspirata which covered recent silt on the banks of the Logan and Shari rivers. The HE resulting 74. Sources and specific techniques used in African history, general outline. Malaria and sleeping sickness make these into very uninviting areas. In short, to arrive at a clear understanding of human life in the Chad Basin, which in the past underwent several quaternary fluctuations due to changes of climate, the historian must investigate the whole range of specific sources and techniques from the earth and life sciences. The present distribution of peoples, their past migrations, their agricultural and pastoral activity and so on are all closely conditioned by the environment. The Chad Basin is but one example among many. And intellectual inquiry has freed itself from restrictive preconceptions. Equally enlightening results have been achieved. The Mbomg, the Niandratam or Buni of the Ombo Valley, who are related to the Turkana of northwest Kenya. There is a striking difference in the blood of the men tested 300 in 1971 and 359 in 1972. The HE difference, which is immunological, is observable not between the sexes but between villages which consist of from 20 to 300 inhabitants. These villages, where the people live by stock raising, agriculture, food gathering, hunting and fishing, are organized in accordance with a strict clan system, complicated by division into territorial sections. But in this society there is no chief higher than the eldest son. Thus the differences that arise out of the territorial social organization of the Neanderthal are reflected in serology. The MVP of serum reactions to arboviral antigens is an exact replica of the territorial distribution of the peoples tested. To this example of active cooperation between the parasitologist and the anthropologist is instructive for the historian, who can't put it to very good use. It is important to him to know that such documentary evidence exists and might prove relevant in investigating the sexual behavior and demographic growth of the Neanderthal. The basic heuristic and epistemological problem remains the same. The historian of Africa simply must be alert to every kind of analytical procedure, so that his own work may be based on a wide range of knowledge and so be cohesive. This open-mindedness is particularly important in the case of the early periods, for which there are neither written sources nor even direct oral traditions. We know, for example, that the staple crop of Neolithic man was wheat, barley and millet in Asia, Europe and Africa and maize in America, but we have no way of ascertaining the original agricultural systems of this very remote period. We cannot tell the difference between a population of sedentary predators and a population of farmers, nor do we know how or when the domestication of plants spread in the different continents. Oral tradition and mythology are not much help here. Only archaeology and paleobotany can give an adequate answer to these important questions about that priceless Neolithic heritage, agriculture. In a favorable, non-acid soil, the outer skin of the pollen grain is very too. Cf. The work of François Rodhain, entomologist, and Serge Tournai, ethnologist, both members of the French expedition to Ombo led by M. Yves Coppens 1971, 1972. 75. Methodology and African prehistory. Resistant to time. Paleopalynology proceeds by microscopic analysis of these botanical remains. Fossil pollens may be recovered by slowly macerating the soil sample in hot hydrofluoric or hydrochloric acid, which eliminates the silica and limestone without harming the pollen, and then the organic humus potash. The He residue is then centrifuged, stained and mounted in gelatin. All that remains is to identify and count the pollen grains, thus arriving at a percentage table which gives the pollen profile of the sediment in question. Why this means we establish whether agriculture was practiced on the site, follow the development of the landscape, diagnose the climate through variations in the vegetation, and detect any possible effects of man and animals on the plant life. Such studies have enabled us to follow the domestication of food plants in Africa. This was focused on several centers, and spread over wide areas. The main plants then cultivated were sorghum, originally domesticated in the savanna that stretches from Lake Chad to the border between Ethiopia and the Sudan, millet, African rice, veal and the forage peas, oil palms domesticated on the edge of the forests, finger millet, gumbo and the African yam. American food plants were introduced comparatively recently, as is attested by specific written sources. Manioc, for example, now the staple food of several peoples in Central Africa, did not reach the Kingdom of Congo via the Atlantic coast until after the 16th century. The MOMG food plants grown on the plateau surrounding Mbanza, Congo, capital of the kingdom, Pigafetta and Lopez's relation in 1591 mentions only Luco, i.e. Eluzin coracana, whose seed comes from the banks of the Nile, in the area where it fills the second lake. 3 Masa Congo, a grass which is a species of sorghum, maize, called Masango or Masama Ampu 2, which is the least value and is fed to the pigs, for rice or lozo, which is not much value either. 5 The banana palm Mordicondo, and the oil palm, Bob. Less well known is the fact that African food plants also spread abroad. There is no doubt that certain African species spread to India, for example, and to other parts of Asia, though they did so comparatively late. Both kinds of millet and finger millet are tested by archaeological evidence in India about 1000 years before our era. Sorghum was only known there later, for there is no word for it in Sanskrit. All this archaeological and paleobotanical data helps the historian, in the absence of any written sources or oral tradition, to elucidate the stages by which our Neolithic ancestors moved from a food-gathering economy to a producing one. Moreover, the facts themselves bear witness better than any diffusionist theories to the currents of relationship between Neolithic civilizations. 3. F. Pigafetta and D. Lopez, ROME, page 40, Tenendo Cement Decaliter Fume Nilo, in quella part of MPIL Secondo Lago. 4. Hibit, ed il mai il piv vile d2d, che dassi a porsi. 5. Hibit, il risoli in poco trizo. 76. Sources and specific techniques used in African history, general outline. Remains of dogs, pigs, sheep and goats suggest that the domestication of animals began, in the case of the Neolithic centers of the Middle East, at about the same time as the cultivation of plants, that is, between 9000 and 8000 before our era. The strength of this, a theoretical chronology for the domestication of the different groups of animals has been put forward. First came scavengers like the dog, then nomadic animals like the reindeer, goat and sheep, and then those for which a sedentary life is required, i.e. cattle and pigs. The last to be domesticated were probably draft animals such as a horse, donkey and llama. But this general chronology does not always apply to Africa. The horse, which together with the ox and the ass has been a driving force in history down the ages, does not appear in Africa to be precise, in Egypt until towards the end of the Hyksos invasion, around 1600 before our era. This is shown by both textual and iconography sources. About the 13th century before our era the horse was transmitted, for use in war, to the Libyans, and later, at the beginning of the first millennium, to the Nubians. Apart from the areas influenced by our Roman civilization, the rest of Africa did not make extensive use of the horse until the Arab conquests of the Middle Ages. TWO horses, saddled and bridled and flanked by 2 rams, were among the emblems of the King of Mali, according to the writer Ibn Battuta 1304-69. The one-hummed camel or dromedary was also no late-comer to African civilization. It appears in a reasonably recognizable form in a rock painting in the Chad Sahara dating from the 3rd century before our era. In 525 before our era Cambyses Indian introduced it into Egypt, where it thenceforward played an important part in communications between the Nile and the Red Sea. Only later did it reach the Western Sahara, essentially a denizen of the desert, where it often takes the place of ox or ass. It seems to have been taken to the Maghreb by Roman troops of Syrian origin. The Berbers, resisting the Pax Romana and its land tenure arrangements, gained their freedom thanks to the camel, which enabled them to go and settle in the steppes and deserts beyond the Latins. This resulted in the sedentary blacks of the oases being driven south or reduced to slavery. All the above leads to the conclusion, in itself a distinct step forward in methodology, that the rich and varied mass of documentary material is to be obtained through the use of sources and techniques derived from the physical and biological sciences. The historian finds himself compelled to be bold in his investigations. All avenues are to be explored. In the new methodology, the phrase auxiliary sciences loses its meaning, unless the auxiliary sciences of history are henceforth understood to mean techniques fundamental to the understanding of history which may come from any branch of science and which have not yet all been discovered. Technical investigations are henceforth part of a historian's job, and they shift history a long way in the direction of science. History also benefits from the discoveries of the earth and life sciences. 77. Methodology and African prehistory. However, the biggest contribution to its critical and research equipment comes, in the case of African history, from other human and social sciences, viz. Egyptology, linguistics, oral tradition, economics and political science. It is worth dwelling a little on Egyptology, because it is a source that has so far not been used for the history of Africa. Egyptology comprises historical archaeology and the deciphering of texts. In both cases a knowledge of Egyptian is an essential prerequisite. Egyptian, which was a living language for about 5,000 years if we include Coptic, occurs in three different scripts, one hieroglyphic writing, consisting of signs which fall into two main categories. First, there are diagrams or word signs, e.g. the representation of a woven basket to denote the word basket, in which the main phonetic components are NB, and secondly, there are phonograms or sound signs, e.g. the representation of a basket which only retains the phonetic value NB, this sign also serving to convey words other than basket which possess the same phonetic value, such as NB, Lord and NB. All phonograms are divided into 8 triliterals, that is, signs containing 3 consonants, B biliterals, or signs containing 2 consonants, and C uniliterals, or signs containing only 1 vowel or 1 consonant. These constitute the Egyptian phonetic alphabet. To hieratic writing, a cursive form of hieroglyphics, which appeared in about the 3rd dynasty 2778 to 2423 before our era. It always runs from right to left, and was written with a calamus or reed pen on sheets of papyrus, potsherd or stone. It had as long a life as hieroglyphics. The most recent hieroglyphic text dates from 394 of our era. 3D Modic writing, itself a simplification of hieratic. It made its appearance about the 25th dynasty 751 to 656 before our era and disappeared from use in the 5th century. In terms simply of graphemes, the COMMON origin is accepted for Demotic Egyptian script and Nubian Meroitic writing, the latter having not yet been deciphered. The Egyptian writing system raises interesting methodological questions. Through such a graphic convention, which has its OWN special character, any historian who learns to decipher a little can as it were capture the state of mind and intentions of an long dead, given that the physical act of writing always reflects a basically human value. To decipher is to converse, involving as it does a constant effort to be accurate and objective. Moreover, the diversity, complexity and progressive simplification of the Egyptian graphic system are themselves part of history, and the history of deciphering is one of the essential sources of all historical accuracy. Thus with the Egyptian writing system Africa occupies an important place in 78. Sources and specific techniques used in African history, general outline. General studies of writing as a system of signs and human intercommunication. 6. The problem of the spread of Egyptian writing within Black Africa enlarges still further the scope of the historian's methodological apparatus, and opens up entirely new perspectives in African historical research. The following few facts are relevant. Dakandi is an ideographical system formerly in use among the Kikuyu of Kenya, and the pictograms of this graphic system show striking analogies with Egyptian pictograms. The structural resemblance between the Ensibidae pictograms of the Efik country southeastern Nigeria and Egyptian pictograms was recognized and reported as early as 1912 by an English scholar, P.M. et al. That the Egyptian hieroglyphs still show a distinct structural affinity to the signs used in the Ment script in southern Sierra Leone, and the same is true of most of the signs used in the Eldo Amba script in northern Liberia. There is also an undoubted causal connection between Egyptian hieroglyphs and several of the signs used in the Bai script in the neighborhood of Monrovia, Liberia. The writing of the BMUM of Cameroon, which also has more than 2 graphic systems, shows an equal number of striking analogies, admittedly external ones, with the hieroglyphs of the Nile Valley. Just as in Egypt, Dogon, Bambara and Bozo hieroglyphs can be broken down into their components and analyzed. But the most significant fact is that these signs from West Africa have the effect of making the things and people they denote aware of themselves. This is an idea typical of the transcendent power of writing, and is found in littoral form in Egypt in the way certain texts on the afterlife are written. There is thus still a considerable possibility that we shall see the birth and development of an epigraphy and a paleography hitherto completely unknown, concerned with the thorough study of Black African writing systems and their interrelationships. Historians will obviously stand to gain, for the history of writing and deciphering throws light on the history of the men who did the writing. The study of writing systems is in itself an invaluable source of history. But historians should always keep a proper sense of the time scale, for many of these writing systems are recent in date and do not throw light on early periods. What their abundance does indicate is the remarkable longevity of the impact of Egypt. Egyptian writing, which supposedly disappeared in 394 of our era, is seen to have had an unbroken series of revivals between the 17th and 19th centuries. The break between antiquity and Africa's recent past is thus an illusion born of our ignorance. In fact, the two are linked by an underground stream. Knowledge of Egyptian writing and ability to decipher the texts gives direct access to the language of the pharaohs. It is always advisable for historians to go back as much as possible to the original texts, for translations, even the best of them, are seldom perfect. The historian who knows Egyptian can thus read for himself the many varied texts of ancient 6. E. B. below HF 1959. 79. Methodology and African Prehistory. Egypt, funerary stele, inscriptions on monuments, administrative documents, hymns, philosophical works, medical and mathematical treatises, and literature novels, tales and fables. One series of texts shows clearly that the barrier supposed to have existed between Pharaonic Egypt and neighboring regions of Africa in this remote period does not accord with the facts. An example to illustrate this is the letter which Nefertari-Repet XI of Pharaoh of the 6th dynasty, wrote in about 2370 before our era to her Khufu, leader of a trading expedition to the remote regions of the South, a land on the edge of the world according to the text, probably the area of the African lakes. This far-flung expedition, the fourth of a series, brought a pygmy back with it. Another Egyptian text dating from the 20th century before our era, the very beginning of the 12th dynasty, gives precise and most interesting information about the life of sailors in those days, navigation in the Red Sea, and trade relations between the Nile Valley and the East African coast. This text is the tale of the castaway Queen Hatshepsut, who occupied the throne of Egypt for 21 years 1504 to 1483 before our era, organized several trading expeditions, including one in the 9th year of her reign to the land of Punt on the Somali coast. The expedition is portrayed in the magnificent bas-reliefs at Der al-Bari in Upper Egypt. This suggests a whole new avenue of research, which is bound to interest African historians. We are just beginning to see the importance of introducing ancient Egyptian as a subject in African universities. The latter, after all, have a great responsibility for promoting up-to-date work on Africa's cultural heritage over the whole of its range in both time and space. As to the linguistic affiliations of ancient Egyptian, the following extract is taken from the final report of an important international symposium on the peopling of ancient Egypt and the deciphering of the Meroitic script, Cairo, 28 January 3 February 1974. The Egyptian language could not be isolated from its African context, and its origin could not be fully explained in terms of Semitic. It was thus quite normal to expect to find related languages in Africa. Final report, page 29, Parad. 5. In plain language, Pharaonic Egyptian is not a Semitic language, and it were best to abandon the descriptions Hamito-Semitic or Afro-Asiatic applied to it by certain authors who are often grounded neither in Semitic studies nor in Egyptology. The fundamental problem that confronts us is to find appropriate techniques for comparing ancient Egyptian with contemporary Black African languages, in order, so far as possible, to reconstruct, on the basis of morphological, lexicological and phonetic analogies and affinities, their common ancestors. An enormous task awaits the linguistics expert, and the historian also must be prepared for a radical change of viewpoint when a cultural macrostructure common to Pharaonic Egypt and the rest of Black Africa is brought to light. Such a common factor is, properly speaking, 80. Sources and specific techniques used in African history, general outline. Matter of guesswork and awaits formal proof. But here more than anywhere else the historian and the expert linguist must work together, for linguistics has become a historical source, particularly in Africa, where so many languages overlap. It is mainly a matter of comparative and historical linguistics. The method adopted is comparative and inductive, for the object of the comparison is to reconstruct, i.e. to find the point of convergence of all the languages being compared. This point of convergence will be called the common pre-dialectal language. But we must proceed with great caution. Bantu, for example, reconstructed on the basis of suitable studies of the various Bantu languages found today, is neither an ancient language nor a real one fully restored. The expression Common Bantu or Proto-Bantu denotes only the system of correlations between the known Bantu languages, which supposedly go back to the time when these languages were almost identical. The same is true of, for example, Indo-European. In strictly realistic terms, linguistic archaeology on an extreme view is purely illusory, since no historical or even merely linguistic trace survives of the remote prehistoric period when the reconstructed common language was spoken. The point of historical linguistics lies not so much in finding the common pre-dialectal language as in appreciating the overall linguistic spread of different, apparently unrelated, languages. A language is seldom enclosed within a clearly defined space, but most commonly overflows its own area by making relationships with other languages of varying degrees of kinship, such relationships being sometimes imperceptible at first. The important underlying problem is obviously that of population movements. The common language does not necessarily go together with racial identity, but it does give relevant information about an essential, indeed the only real, unity, namely, the basic cultural unity of people united by a common language, even though sometimes with very different origins and political systems. For example, the Niger-Congo family, if we accept such an entity, indicates that there are very ancient socio-cultural links between the West Atlantic peoples, Amande, Gore and Kw peoples, the peoples living between the Benue and the Congo Zaire, the Adamawa Eastern peoples and the Bantu peoples of East, Central and Southern Africa. Historical linguistics is thus a valuable source for African history, as is oral tradition, though the latter was for long despised. But it sometimes happens that oral tradition is the only source immediately available. This is the case, for example, with the Mbaki of the Congo. It is only with the help of oral tradition that it has been possible to reconstruct the history in space and time, admittedly a comparatively short time, of their various chiefdoms. Oral tradition can also settle the point where written records are useless. The chroniclers Delaport, 1753, and Proyot, 1776 agree in recording that in the kingdom of Loanga, in western Central Africa, the kings were buried into separate cemeteries, one at Lubu and the other at July. As to when 81. Methodology and African prehistory. And why such a distinction was made, the written records so far known are silent. Only the oral tradition of the present day gives the explanation for the separation. An extremely violent quarrel between the Malongo court and the people of July made the king and princes of the day decide to change the burial place and temps. As the result of a conflict between the crown and a rich province of the kingdom, the cemetery at July was abandoned in favor of the one at Lubu. In this case, oral tradition comes plausibly to the rescue of written evidence. There are countless instances in Africa where it guides archaeological excavation, as well as simultaneously shedding light on written chronicles. The excavations carried out at the end of I-960 at Texto, the town in the Kingdom of Ghana, Western Sudan, by Professors J. Davis and D. and S. Robert, then of the University of Dakar, used simultaneously and in combination local traditions, medieval Arab chronicles and normal archaeological techniques. Thus a little-known period of African history, the 7th to 13th centuries, was restored to the archives. The credit goes of course mainly to archaeology, but also partly to local tradition and written records. Such examples, which could be multiplied, show that in Africa more than anywhere else oral tradition is an integral part of the historian's basic material and greatly widens its scope. African history can no longer be written, as in the past, by excluding from historical investigation the voice of time represented by oral tradition. The key points, first of how oral tradition presents time itself, and secondly of how it presents events in time, have not yet been adequately investigated. The crucial question is how the griot presents history. African griots almost never use a chronological framework. They do not set out the sequence of human events with their breaks or accelerations in pace. What they say needs to be heard in perspective, and cannot be listened to in any other way. The point is that they are interested in the end only as he is caught up in life, a possessor of values reacting in the world, timelessly. This is why the African griot tends not to synthesize the various moments of the story he is telling. He treats each moment in isolation, as something with its own meaning and having no precise relationship to other moments. The moments of the events reported are disconnected. The correct term for this is absolute history. An absolute history, which sets out stages of development in the round, without dates, is simply structural history. The temporal outcrops known elsewhere as cycles, the idea of a circle, periods, the idea of a space of time, eras, the idea of a pause, or a moment marked by some important event, ages, the idea of duration, the passage of time, series, the idea of a sequence or succession, and moments, the idea of immediacy, of circumstance, of time present, are virtually omitted from the griot's vocabulary. Admittedly, he does not neglect either cosmic time, seasons, years, and so on, or man's past, since what is in the past is just what he does recount, but it is not easy for him to make a model of time. He gives at one go the whole fullness of a time. 82. Sources and specific techniques used in African history, general outline. Still in the realm of the human and social sciences, the contribution of sociologists and political theorists enables us to redefine the elements of cultural and historical knowledge. The notions of kingdom, nation, state, empire, democracy, feudalism, political party, and so on, while certainly appropriate elsewhere, are not always automatically applicable to Africa. For example, let us consider what exactly is meant by the Kingdom of Congo. The people themselves use the expression NSIA Congo, literally the country miles of the Congo. We thus have an ethnic group, the Congo, a region, NSIA, and the ethnic group's consciousness of living in this region, which thus becomes the country NSIA of the ethnic group in question. Borders and frontiers are extremely fluid, being a function of the way clans and subgroups of the ethnic group are dispersed. The word kingdom here denotes a territory exclusively peopled by men and women all belonging to one ethnic group. Ethnic, linguistic and cultural homogeneity is essential. The king Enthemu is in fact the eldest son, Enthemu the maternal uncle, Enthemu of every family Enzo and every matrilineal clan Makanda that recognizes common founder ancestors Bankulu Impiangu. If we examine the situation more closely, what the Kingdom of Congo comes down to is really one huge chiefdom, i.e. a system of government incorporating the small local chiefdoms. The king is the oldest of the eldest sons, the oldest living maternal uncle, and it is this that makes him the Ntinu, or supreme chief. So the Kingdom of Congo does not denote a state ruled by a king in the Western sense. After all, this Western sense, as in, for example, the Kingdom of George 111, is a late, inappropriate bastard sense, in short, a particular case of the transition from state to national state via absolute monarchy. The Kingdom of Dangsombe, in the modern Republic of Benin on the other hand, comes closer to the pattern of an absolute monarchy, as typified in France by the unfortunate version that prevailed from Henri IV to Louis XVI. Here there is a permanent heartland and, as Professor Glalie has shown, it had a central authority consisting of the king, his ministers and the ministers' delegates. The king was the very essence of power, and had all the attributes of authority and control. He had the power of life and death over his subjects, the Anato, the men of the people, from among whom the king, master and owner of all wealth. Chose and recruited glisi, i.e. farmers for his estates or to give as presents to the princes and chiefs. Central authority in the villages and regions was exercised by chiefs in the king's name. Thus the kingdom of Dangsom emerges as a highly centralized state organization with the chiefdom system of administrative decentralization operating within it. Thus we have a central authority controlling the people, the Dangsomen, via the chiefdoms. In the course of history, as conquests were made, other countries were annexed and added to the heartland of the original ethnic group. So from time to time a process of conquest and of acculturation and assimilation was at work among neighboring and related peoples. Fon. 83. Methodology and African Prehistory. Mahi, Alada, Sadi, Judah, and so on. The He kingdom thus became a multiracial state, organized and centralized through a powerful military and administrative machine, and a strongly controlled economy. In the period immediately preceding colonization, the kingdom of Dangsom was a genuine nation-state in which dialogue, the palaver and the consent of the governed through the chiefdoms were a principle of government. Hence, as the examples of Congo and Dangsom made clear, the word kingdom does not mean the same thing throughout Africa, and historians should therefore be very careful in their use of the term. It will also have been noted that in Congo the chieftaincy corresponded to a system of government, whereas in the former kingdom of Dangsom it was a form of administrative decentralization. In the general context of Western Europe, if not always in specific applications, the term feudalism may be understood in the sense used by medievalists of legalistic bent as that which concerns the circumflex accent / instituted in about the 10th or 11th century and the set of relationships, loyalty, homage and dues, linking the vassal to his lord, who owned the estate. This sense of the word excludes peasants, who are not part of the upper classes. Marxists, on the other hand, use the term feudalism in a very wide sense to mean the mode of production characterized by the economic exploitation of the lower classes serfs by the ruling classes feudal lords. Serfs are tied to the land and dependent on the lord. The latter may no longer kill the serf, but may sell him limited property rights over the workers. Serfdom takes the place of slavery, but many aspects of slavery still survive. Serfs or peasants are not involved in the running of affairs, nor do they hold administrative posts. In the context of the evolution of European society, the feudal system is an intermediate stage in the formation of the capitalist economy. But many Marxists still confuse the political notion of feudalism with the socio-economic notion of seigneury, which, thanks to Marx, historians since 1847 have learned to differentiate. But whichever sense of the word is adopted, the question remains whether the regimes of medieval Europe really existed in an identical form in pre-colonial Black Africa. Only comparative sociological studies, of which very few have so far been made, could properly answer this question and supply the necessary distinctions. Attention has already been drawn to the feudal nature of the organization of the Bariba Republic of Benin mainly as a working hypothesis. Work on feudalism in Black Africa is at such an early stage that the historian should be more cautious, and the so-called feudal tendencies shown by Black African societies probably rest not on actual rights arising from the granting of a fief, but on a form of political organization rooted in a particular system of social and economic relationships. Thus the work of sociologists and political theorists may also provide sources for historians to use. In Africa the historian's archetypes vary enormously according to period and subject, and also according to the 84 sources and specific techniques used in African history. General outline.